Okay, so good morning, everyone, or good afternoon now. 2 minutes past, so we'll get going. I think a few people are still dialing in, but it's nice to see so many familiar names and some new ones I've not seen before. So, welcome to our webinar today about connections reform and Clean Power 2030. I'm sure you'll all agree it's a busy time at the moment with changes that are coming in. So, hopefully, we will be able to distill some of these down for you today, and we can all go away a little bit more informed. So I will just move on to the next slide.
Hi everybody. Just a brief housekeeping on the webinar. So the webinar will be recorded, and its recording that has already started. A link will be available to all attendees post-event. So for those who aren't able to attend but have registered, you'll also receive this. As a default, just during the presentation, we've turned all cameras and microphones off just to ensure we get through the presentation. We've also got a Q&A section, so if you have a look along the top, there should be a tab for Q&A. So please put any questions that you have, obviously, during the session within that section, and we will answer as many as we can across the time that we've got. There is also going to be some polls during the webinar, so you will see them pop up on your screen briefly, and then once you've answered, they'll disappear, and they'll also be in the chat as well. So yeah, if anyone has any issues, obviously you can raise your hand, or please use the Q&A or the chat. Back to you, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there should be some polls on the screen right now if they've popped up. There you go. Just good to get an idea of where everyone's coming from. So it looks like we're quite heavily weighted towards battery and generation, which is good news, as this will affect those projects. A little bit of I&C, data center, and EV as well. So a nice spread, I think. And I think we have another one. Okay, I can't see that popping up, so I think we'll just crack on. So, today we're going to cover a little bit about who we are, Eclipse. Some of you may already know, but as I say, there's some new names on the list, so just a bit of an overview of what we do as a business. Look at TMO4 Plus, the reform to the queue process for grid connections, the recent Clean Power 2030 announcement, and how those will all be applied to the queue going forwards as we move away from a first come, first served grid connection process to more of a centrally planned approach. Also going to touch on some changes that are being made for DNO applications, G99 applications, and proposals for financial instruments, and then fundamentally what it could mean for your projects and what to do next. So I think no, never mind. Seems to be missing a slide here. Never mind. So there was meant to be a slide here about the Eclipse Power Group. We are predominantly an IDNO, so adopting distribution networks up to 132 kV in England and Wales and 33 in Scotland. We've been going since 2017 and have had a large focus on the EHV space, particularly battery and generation. Not having a gas and water license, that's where we've typically focused. As a result of that, we got to know a lot about the grid connection process, and people often were asking us for advice on things. So a year ago, or just over a year ago now, we set up Eclipse Power Solutions, where I sit to provide grid consultancy and advice earlier in the development process to our customers. We complement the IDNO, but we're not tied to it. Elsewhere in the group, we applied to Ofgem for a transmission license back in 2022 to extend the IDNO principle for last mile transmission to the transmission market. Unfortunately, Ofgem didn't see fit to grant at this moment in time, but it's still something we're keeping on the back burner. So instead, as of January, we're launching Eclipse Power Optimize, which is a private networks company to own and adopt large-scale private networks at transmission or the other end of the scale down to small residential microgrids, co-locating generation and demand in single sort of private networks, which could potentially mitigate some of the reforms we see coming through. So just an introduction to myself. My name's Charles. I have been with the business 2 years now. Initially in the IDNO as responsible for managing the upstream connections interface on our larger projects, and then moving over to set up Eclipse Power Solutions in October 2023. I previously was working on a development side for various solar and storage developers in grid connections. So I remember the heady days of 2018 where you'd apply for a grid connection, it would come back as the DNO said, and you wouldn't need statement of works, and you could connect, the next week if you're ready. But how times have changed. So I'm also joined on the call by my brilliant team. So I've got Matt, if you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charlie. And yeah, afternoon, everyone. Good to see so many of you joining. So yeah, my name is Matt. I work as a grid consultant with EPS. So I joined pretty much a year ago now, so a few months after EPS was formed. Mainly focusing on supporting our clients, both IDNO and external, with their connections, with a particular focus on transmission connections. This could be anything from sort of early stage contractual reviews, so understanding, for example, your offer details, any liabilities, any sort of scope of works for the overall connection, and it can also vary from cable route assessment, actual sort of connection design, and getting projects into build and commissioning. Previous experience mainly is like Charlie in the development world, working for a developer which again focused on mainly transmission connected projects.
Thank you, Matt.
That's me.
And Emma.
Hi all, afternoon. Thanks guys for the great introduction. I'm not sure what more I can add to that really. They covered it pretty well, but I'm a grid engineer with Eclipse Power Solutions. I joined about a year ago. My main focus is more on distribution, given my previous experience in electrical design engineering for the ICP, mainly in major projects for distribution, so covering residential and industrial and commercial. Currently, my role is mainly assessing grid feasibility, so gauging the viability of proposed projects, mainly through feasibility assessments and offer appraisals, also leading on liaison with the DNO and National Grid on behalf of clients.
Thank you. So thanks, guys. They will be on hand to answer any questions later and throughout also. So I've just seen the result of the poll. How is your understanding of connections reform? 78% have said fair, so good, we're in the right place. I'm a little bit worried about you 6% who say excellent. So do pick me up on anything that you may disagree with. Right, so without further ado, so connections reform is basically a bit of a catch-all term for what's essentially been two processes. So you may have heard of the terminology TMO4+. This was the preferred design put forward by NESO for reforms to the connections process, specifically the transmission element of grid offers. So that was two code mods, CMP 434 for what we're going to do with new applications going forwards, and CMP 435 about how we apply that retrospectively to the existing queue. This is relevant to all transmission connections, be it generation or demand, and relevant embedded generators, and by that I mean those which have an impact on the transmission system. So that will be anything that typically is over 1 megawatt in England and Wales or 200 kilowatts in Scotland. There are proposals in flight to maybe lift that limit to 5 megawatts in England and Wales, but at the moment it remains at about 1 megawatt. In some areas it can be smaller. This was brought in because, as we all know, the queue is too large and it was becoming unmanageable. So it was looking at raising the entry requirements to get into the queue, and Ofgem directed urgency on that proposal. Rather perhaps unhelpfully, as we were in the code process, it was sort of decided that maybe this didn't go far enough. So Clean Power 2030 was published in what was commissioned by NESO and by Ofgem and government in August this year, to further raise barriers and move to a more sort of centrally planned system about what generation mix we need for the Clean Power 2030 goals. Now that is only relevant for generation projects, so all transmission generators and all relevant embedded generators as well. So I guess an overview of where we are and what we've done and where we've got to today. So these CUSC modifications I've just mentioned, they were proposed by NESO earlier this year. There was a series of industry work groups, I think 26 for 435 and 37 for 434. So it was quite a large process, with self-nominated parties who are parties to the CUSC. So anyone essentially with a transmission connection. Eclipse Power was represented on those two working groups by my colleague Bill Scott and I. During that process, there was an RFI issued to ask customers, can you meet these new requirements, essentially? And a lot of people said yes. So it was decided that perhaps they didn't go far enough. So Ofgem issued this open letter in August, as I mentioned, to look at additional measures, which has resulted in some methodologies which sit outside of the code, which is unusual, which will describe how this will all be put into practice, and the code will reference them. Ofgem are currently consulting on license changes for NESO and the DNOs about maintaining these methodologies and how they can be changed, and kind of the governance around it, which personally I think is definitely needed. So at the moment, we are in this sort of first orange box. So consultation on both of those pieces has closed now. NESO are due to put their final recommendation to Ofgem this Friday. Merry Christmas for Ofgem. And we expect a decision in Q1 2025. This has all been pushed back by about 3 months because this was initially supposed to happen in around November time. And we expect to see implementation in Q2 next year, probably likely to be May, which is when the first window will open for existing connections in the queue, which we'll go into in a minute. To sort of tie this together, there's a series of connections reform hubs going on at the moment. Sorry, I'm getting blinded by the sun. Nice problem to have. Connections reform hubs with all the network operators, including Eclipse Power and other INA members, about how this is actually going to be put into practice. You may have received a transitional offer recently when applying to the transmission system, which is essentially a light touch offer with no detail. That was to allow them to be assessed in the first CMP 435 window. And from implementation, any new applications will be in what's called the cutover period, which means you will not get a full offer until the first new application window, basically, which is forecast to be November this year, so 3 months after that date. And other consultations and proposals that are currently sitting around it include G99 changes, financial instruments, and the end-to-end connections consultation. Excuse me. I've still got a bit of a cold from the other week, which is basically the carrot and stick for network operators to actually keep their side of the bargain. So going forwards, you will only be able to apply for a grid connection, a transmission element of the grid connection, so either a direct transmission application or a project progression or similar, twice a year in 2 annual windows. The forecast date for the first window for new applications will be November 2025. And as I say, the first initial window for the existing queue will be around May time. As you can see here, it can be quite an elongated process, perhaps up to 6 months to get an offer. The reason being is that instead of assessing each connection one by one, what NESO will do is essentially package up all of the connections together in the window and assess them together, to hopefully design the network more efficiently, similar to what we saw for offshore wind during the holistic network design exercise. The difference between the offers, a Gate 2 offer is an offer as we know it today. It will have your confirmed POC, your confirmed connection date, all the works. You'll have to pay securities or cancellation charges if they are applicable, and you will get a queue position. And that is for both distribution and transmission. Gate 1 is personally, I think, a bit of a pointless step now. It was supposed to be mandatory, but that was changed. It's also, I believe, only going to be available for transmission connections rather than distribution as well. Everything in there will be indicative. It will be a worst case date, worst case POC, but again, no cancellation charges, but no queue position. You can move from Gate 1 to Gate 2 at whatever window you like, as long as you're within your milestones, or you can apply straight in at Gate 2. Something to also note here is if you have a project which you have securities or cancellation charges on, but you're not particularly liking the look of it, one method to get out of it would be to let it go into Gate 1 in that first window, and then you can effectively get a free cancellation. So what does it mean to be Gate 2 ready? Fundamentally, not much. There's only a land requirement. So you need to have your option to lease for at least 3 years for new applications. For existing queue, there is no sort of time limit on it, but it must cover the connection date, or you have a freehold interest in the land, or interestingly, you've submitted a DCO application for which you intend to use to get your land rights later. Planning, you don't need planning to be Gate 2. You do need to submit a red line boundary, which must meet the minimum acreage based on the land density table that NESO have published. Interestingly, again, that does not need to be the same red line boundary as you put in at the application for transmission, but once you put it in the Gate 2 process, it's then fairly fixed, and a self-declaration letter. To remain in Gate 2, you must keep your land signed up and, with a lease long enough for the connection date. You must then submit planning either by your milestone date in your agreement, or what's being proposed is 2 years for town and country planning or 3 years for an NSIP, whichever is earlier of those dates. Now, the red line boundary rules, it's worth noting that for DNOs, nothing changes. The usual allowable change guidance will apply, but at transmission, they will let you build 50% of it outside of that red line boundary if you need to. Any more that's built outside of it will not be allowed, and your tech will be reduced accordingly. So that's what it means to be Gate 2, and at your Gate 2 window, be it the one in May for the existing queue or November for new applications, you would submit this directly to NESO or to your DNO if you are a distribution connection, and then you'll get put into that Gate 2 assessment and get a firm offer. So that was the proposal, but then because far too many people essentially said, yeah, we can do this, it's not really a big issue, Ofgem was instructing NESO to look again at other things they can do. So you may have seen in the media recently, Clean Power 2030. There's been more of a focus on this since the election, with the target of a net zero grid, effectively, or 95% renewable grid, as it actually is going to be, by 2030. So what NESO has done is they have split the country up into the 14 license areas for DNOs and 17 transmission zones, and effectively put technology quotas per zone that they will need to meet these goals based on essentially an economic assessment. I won't go into all the detail of this because there is a lot. The graphs are also fairly grainy. I haven't yet seen a full sort of Excel breakdown of this, but some of the figures that we might be playing with are here. So again, as I say, we're moving towards a sort of centrally planned, strategically aligned system rather than a first come first served approach as we've done before. Presently, this will only look to 2035. After 2035, we'll be governed by sorry for all the acronyms, the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, which will inform the Centralised Strategic Network Plan, which will basically forecast out everything that we need for the next 20, 30, 40 years, perhaps. That is being consulted on, starts in January, and or I think might close in January, and that will then be published in 2026, which should hopefully give more investment certainty going forwards. So just some key trends that I thought were worth mentioning based on at least my understanding of this data. The excuse me. The requirements for solar PV are heavily weighted towards distribution, and there's not much of a need forecast for it at transmission. Also worth noting that if you are connecting to the transmission system via an IDNO, such as Eclipse, you are counted as a transmission connection. BESS, on the other hand, is forecast to be heavily needed at transmission. However, looking at the paper the government published on Friday, it looks like they're not forecasting the need for any new transmission BESS after 2030, which is probably quite stark. And then that will be focused on distribution instead. At the distribution level, SSE South seems to be the only undersupplied area at the moment based on current queues. If anyone's taken a punt on onshore winds, then you made a good gamble, because obviously that's been undersupplied given the planning restrictions we've had recently. And important to note, there is still going to be a need for some fossil fuels, mainly sort of repowering existing assets rather than a large expansion in additional gas capacity, for example. So I'm just going to pause there. This was probably the most important slide. It looks probably quite complicated, but this is essentially how NESO is proposing to apply these two methodologies to the queue. The quite elegant bingo card, I guess, which we've had to put some annotations on given the announcements that came out last week about additional protections. I should also caveat that all of this currently is still under consultation. It's still proposals. It could still change, but this is our best understanding of it as of Friday, basically. So what the DNO will do, or the TO, they will get their zone, they'll look at their quota in their zone, and they'll pull out all the technologies that meet that quota. Hybrid projects, say solar and BESS, will be treated separately if they can both export to the grid. So you might have a project which sits in two gates. Your two technologies are different. If it's behind the meter and can't export to the grid, then you are again sort of safe from this, so to speak. So what they'll do is they will arrange the queue in the current order. The proposal for the queue order at the moment for the existing queue is the NESO countersigning your connection offer. Now, there's some concerns with this, I think, because sometimes this takes a bit of time, especially for distribution projects, because this will be based on NESO countersigning the project progression that they gave your DNO. Now, we all know there's been unacceptable delays in project progression over the years, and this is something that has been raised in the consultations, and it'll be interesting to see how this is dealt with, albeit it probably would be a Herculean task to use DNO acceptance date, but I believe that's something that does need to be looked at. So what they will do is they will split the queue into the two pots. So anything it has a connection date of 2025 to 2030, we'll put in an earlier pot. Anything that's got a connection date of 2030 to 2035, we'll put in a later pot, unless they've asked for their connection date to be brought forwards, which we'll go into on the next slide. They will then order the queue in terms of, find out the planning status of the projects, and then reorder the queue based on the status of the planning, whether you've got planning, whether you've submitted planning, whether you've got land rights. Again, interestingly, for DCOs, NSIPs, planning submitted is considered as planning obtained under the current proposals. Now, the reason this has got an annotation on here is last week, NESO issued something saying they'd looked at the consultation feedback and they wanted to give additional protections to projects. What does that mean? So it means anything that's had planning submitted by next Friday and can achieve planning by that first CMP 435 gate in May. Or you've got a capacity market contract or a contract for difference or some other things relating to interconnectors, which probably isn't relevant for who we're speaking to. That means that you will then be put at the front of that pot in the sort, if you like. So sort of how I'm inferring it is in front of the planning obtained. If you've got a CM contract or a contract for difference as well, NESO will have to honour the connection date that you need for delivery of that contract. So that hopefully provides some more certainty there. Once this queue has been reordered, they will add it all up and go, right, the quota's met here, draw the line, that's the 2025 to 2030 pot, everything else goes back into the later pot. They'll then do the same again for the 2030 to 35 pot, again putting protected projects at the front. The caveat, I guess, for the 2030 to 35 pot is unless you are a protected project, so unless you meet these three things here, you can effectively be bumped out the back of that pot if you exceed the quota. If that occurs, you will not be given a Gate 2 offer. You'll be given a Gate 1 offer, and you'll be put in a holding pen, if you like, until SCCP comes out. However, if you are protected, so you've submitted your planning by the end of next week, got it by May, or you've got one of these two commercial contracts, you will not be pushed out the back. You will still be kept within that pot, but your date, might go back because the 2030 quota is exceeded. Also important to note that if there is an undersupply of a particular technology in an area, NESO may seek to reserve capacity or bays for that undersupply to allow projects to be accelerated through or grab projects from adjacent zones. SCCP will look at this in more detail as well with the spatial element in terms of, can you actually get planning in a particular area? Going forwards, so for the November window for new applications, this step 1 will be ordered based on when you got your Gate 2 ready, when you got your option signed, basically. And there will also be a priority given to projects there that have submitted planning by 20th of December this year, but haven't quite got it by May, but they have got it by November. And there's various edge cases about planning appeals as well that I won't muddy the waters with now. So once distribution and transmission have got this new queue here. Oh, sorry, I should probably mention, after it's been reordered for planning and the quota's been dropped off, they will then be put back into their relevant queue positions based on step 1. So you don't lose out, if you like, if you were number 2 but your planning hasn't come in yet. They will then the DNOs and the TOs will get these two queues. NESO will then intercalate them, so they'll be merged, and then the TOs will restudy that area based on that whole queue. So you can request advancement at the first CMP 435 window. So say you've got a date of 2032, but you could deliver in 2028. You can say to NESO in May, I would like to deliver in 2028, please. And they will go away and they'll speak to the TOs and the DNOs. They would see if that could be feasible. If it was, they would then restudy that. There'll be options such as, you could take a different POC if you wanted, or you could ask for a non-firm offer or technical limits or something like that. You get your new offer out with an earlier date. If you don't like that, you can ask to re-offer back to the original date, but only if you haven't changed pot. So you haven't gone from 2030 to 2035 to 2025 to 2030. Say you've just gone from 2032 to 2031. Once you've accepted that earlier date, you cannot go back to your original. And if you don't accept that offer, then you'll get put on back into Gate 1 and you have to start the whole process again. For projects that can connect earlier under technical limits, which is basically using A&M or a constraint scheme to allow you to connect ahead of transmission works, that will continue to be used. Your non-firm date will be given as 27, for example, but if your firm date is 2035, that's what will be used for your queue allocation process in terms of determining where you fit within this quota. And just finally, WACM 1 was voted for in CMP 435, which basically says that at the close of that first window, there'll be a register published of all the projects that are asked to advance, where their POC is, what their date is, etc. And that will then give you an opportunity to go in for a 10-day pause, have a look, and try and judge whether your advancement request could be feasible or not, based on how many other people in the area have requested to do the same. And then that will give you a chance to withdraw that request should you deem it not viable. Going forward, it will be much simpler because everyone will just go through one of the two biannual windows when you've got Gate 2 to then be aligned with the sort of quota criteria. So going forwards, all offers will be restudied. I think it's 2,000 transmission contracts and a lot more at distribution. So all the transmission elements of that will be restudied by the TOs. It seems likely that is going to prioritize wider works like circuit upratings rather than sort of transformer constraints at SGTs, which may have to come later. But again, that isn't confirmed. This is just potentially, what could happen given the workloads. As mentioned, hybrid projects can have technologies at different dates. Ofgem have directed that all offers should be reissued from NESO by the end of 2025. So that might mean that the DNO gets it on the 31st of December 2025. So actually, you're not going to get it from the DNO if you're embedded for a little while after that. But all the transmission elements will be done by the end of 2025. DNOs, if you're connected to a DNO, will have to provide a variation as necessary. It's still a bit unclear how they will reorder their queues, but again, the ENA have stated that they are looking at that because it would not make sense if they didn't then reorder their own queues to reflect the transmission situation, which might change, say, DNO reinforcement that has to be done. And then finally, there will be impacts on costs, capital contributions, securities and liabilities off the back of that, because the queue will now look different. So that's sort of transmission element of it, if you like. Alongside this, the ENA have been consulting on raising the barrier for DNO elements of the application. Now, as stated earlier, I don't believe that Gate 1 is going to be a thing, if you like, for DNOs. The ENA had originally proposed to need an option to lease to make an application to align it with Gate 2, but they've sort of rowed back on that a bit and have suggested a heads of terms would be acceptable, or a freeholder release. They'll also require more, but they'll also then require you to meet the Gate 2 conditions within appropriate timescales, which isn't quite defined, but I imagine relating to the milestones in the contract. A more detailed SLD, so that has to include all the generation equipment, protection meters, cabling, earthing, switchgear, load details, all that. A site plan, which includes, again, all the generating units, substations, access roads, existing infrastructure, land features, environmental considerations, etc. A project plan, which features key dates, similar to has to be provided later now anyway, but FID, delivery, commissioning, construction. A project viability assessment, a risk management plan, resource allocation, and regulatory compliance considerations. The detail on this is not that detailed yet, so to speak, and I think that part can probably come a little bit later, but it's something that they will be looking for. And also full completion of the G99 form, so you must complete all of part 4, so that includes all the details about your inverters or your turbines or whatever you're installing, your battery storage and your transformers. And the proposal is that's going to come in from 1st of January next year. And then finally, something which kind of slipped below the radar, I think, but as part of the letter that Ofgem wrote to NESO commissioning Clean Power 2030, they suggested there's a need for higher sort of financial commitment from developers for securing grid connections. Not necessarily something I agree with. But the proposal that was initially put out there was that this would capture all generation projects currently with securities and cancellation charges, with a floor of 20 grand a megawatt for securities, and that would be cancellation charges, which will be secured at 100%. That floor would be maintained until your S curve, so the normal security methodology, reaches that level. Once it reaches that level, you will then do securities as you normally would. They're proposing to hold this in place until milestone M7, which is financial investment decision, project commitment, is reached. However, again, this is still early days. A call for input was released in November, which is closed. And if this is going to come in, it will have to go through the code modification process, which probably won't be able to start until sometime next year. So just something to maybe keep in the back of the mind, but I don't think I've met a single industry person who feels that this 20k per megawatt is currently an appropriate figure. So what to do next, really? Consider your project's position in relation to regional quotas. Now, this is difficult because we don't have full detail on the queue, nor will I believe we will due to confidentiality issues. But have a look at the data that's out there and consider where you might be in that queue. If you want to progress, make sure you're Gate 2 ready. Get your option in place in good time, so it's ready to go in May. And given the fact that the queue will then be reordered based on planning status before being put back into their relative positions, get your planning in as soon as you can. If you're thinking of getting CM or CFD contract, again, make that application. And if you have a connection date that's not working for you, it's too far out, consider what would be feasible and viable for you to deliver, and make an advancement request if needed. If all of those things aren't stacking up for your project, and you've currently got financial commitments, securities and cancellation charges, consider not submitting Gate 2 evidence in May next year and slipping back into Gate 1, which might be able to let you leave the queue without any penalty. So that's it, really. I was just going to quickly go back to here and just reiterate the process. So form a sub-queue per technology in each zone, take out everything that isn't Gate 2 ready, put protected projects at the front, reorder in terms of planning status, draw a line when the quota is reached, reorder back into relative status, relative queue position, and then repeat the same process for the later pot. So I'm sure there's some Q&A, so if anyone has any, now is the time to ask.
So we've got a couple in the Q&A section, Charlie. So the first one is from James Potter. What are Eclipse's thoughts on step 7, reordering queue to reflect original queue position? A project that is less advanced in planning has higher planning risk and the attrition rate will be higher. Is there a risk that the earliest connection slots won't be realised as a result?
Yeah, it's a good point. Personally, in our response, we did favour alternative proposal 2, which is not doing that back into the original queue position step, basically, so keeping it as in planning order, which I do think probably has some merit if you want to do this as quickly as the targets say. But we'll have to wait and see what NISA come out with. I know they're very conscious that it needs to still be market-led, and I think they felt that not putting it back into the original relative queue positions was too much of a deviation from that. But my personal view is that, yeah, we should probably prioritise those with planning.
And then from Polina, what's the application submission required to provide relevant information to the embedded generation (DNO? Do we have to send them an email or can it be done via RFI?
Is this for, I assume this is for sort of Gate 2 criteria in May. So yeah, haven't seen the detail on that yet. But you will need to submit that to the DNO to submit to NISO, who will then approve it. NISO have committed to checking everything. Initially, they're just going to check a sample, but there was some pushback on that. I know, again, a lot of people have argued that we need to make sure that there's something in the code to oblige the DNOs to submit in the gated period. So all I would say is do it as soon as you have it, basically as soon as possible. Don't leave it until the 30th of April or whatever.
And then from Yoni, what is the connection between gates and pots?
Sure, so that's a good point. So gates is basically just to do with your land. So if you have your option signed up, you can go into Gate 2, and that's the first step, and then you'll be then put into the sub queue, if you like, per zone for technology. So yeah, it's sort of the first tick in the box, if you like, to move to the next stage. And then the pots refer to 2025 to 2030. We need X number of gigawatts of PV, X number of gigawatts of BESS, and then the same again for 2030 and 2035.
Thank you. And then from Yusuf, regarding protected projects for which planning is submitted, is the case that planning must be submitted by the 20th of December 24 and achieved by May 25, or one of the two conditions is sufficient, for example, either submit by the 20th of December this year or achieve by May 25?
Yeah, again, a really good point. So my understanding is that if it's protected, it basically can't be pushed out the back door of a 2035 pot. Whereas if it isn't protected, it could be. If you have submitted planning by Friday and you get it by May, then you will be considered protected in the first round. If you in May, if you submit planning by Friday the 20th of December and you get it by sort of November, the first 434 window, you will be protected in that round. And I think the proposal currently is you would only need to meet sort of national requirements rather than zonal ones at that point. But it's a good point. If you submitted planning in January and you got it in March, for example, which would be brilliant, I'm sure, you would still be prioritized on your planning status, but you might not necessarily be protected, if you like.
We then have from Callum, Part 4 of G99 has sections that are to be agreed with DNO. Is this expected to be completed in the initial application?
Again, good question. I need to get some more detail from the ENA on that. I think this is more specifically relating to generating unit data and fault level at generating unit terminals, transformer data, impedance, resistance, reactance, all those sort of things, which are really quite essential to building a proper power systems model.
I got another one from Polina. Did NESO confirm that it's achieving planning by May 25, or is it subject to interpretation?
With regards to being protected, so yeah, if it's with regards to being protected, it would be you have to have planning by whenever the first CMP 435 window opens, which is proposed to be May 2025, but that date hasn't been fixed yet. And it is just important to note that protected just means that you won't be pushed out the back of the 2035 pot. You could still be moved back into a later pot unless you have a CM or a CFD, which means you have to deliver by 2028, for example.
Well, thank you. And then what is our level of confidence in the region figures, especially the transmission and distribution split? NGED connecting 14 gigawatts of PV and UKPN connecting 8 gigawatts of PV by 2030 seems optimistic.
Yeah, agreed. It will be interesting to see how it plays out. I guess the idea is that this should give the network operators chance to plan a bit more holistically. But yeah, it will certainly be a challenge, and there could be situations whereby all of the quota in a zone is clustered under one GSP, which then needs to be reinforced when there might be another GSP somewhere else, which has spare capacity. But given the fact that they still want it to be market led, I can't see them intervening more than that.
Is LDES being treated separately from BESS for technology allocations?
Yes, I think there would be separate pots for different durations of storage. So on the bingo chart that NESO put together, their example is short duration storage in zone 1, for example.
Just having a scan through the chat to see if we've got any more. I think we've covered the majority of them. We've got one from Polina in the chat as well. Do you think it's plausible to achieve planning by May if submitted in December, as the town and country planning have never been able to provide planning within their statutory timeframe? So it should be all achieved planning by May. Might have already covered that a little bit.
I'm not a planning consultant, unfortunately. Good question for Mikey, actually. So just going back to the bingo chart. So that's probably a quick way to do this. So demand is considered out of scope of Clean Power 2030. There might be some strategic demand that is brought in at some point, but currently it's not. So for a directly connected demand project, you'll just need to meet gate 2, and then you will be slotted in the queue within your relevant position, depending on the connection date that you've requested or can be delivered. I think there probably needs to be more work done on that by NESO, given the sort of strategic importance demand can play. The same will also apply to designated projects, which is a different methodology, but is only really expected to be things like nuclear that have a really long lead time, but will still meet a pot. But yeah, in short, demand, you just have to be gate 2 ready, and then you'll get given the connection date that can be provided, and you'll be put into the queue at that point.
A couple more flood in, but I'm also conscious of time.
I have a few more minutes. I'm happy to stay
Yeah.
if needed. Yeah.
Perfect. So we've got one from Carl Adams. Hybrid projects were further clarified in the Clean Power 30 assumptions document. It's still not crystal clear, but suggests that these may be treated as solar. I've asked for clarification from NESO. Are there any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so my understanding is that they will look at if the technology can export to the grid, they will look at each technology individually. So it might be that your BESS element does meet the quota, but your solar doesn't. So your solar will then be given a gate 1 offer or a connection date of later. But I do agree there needs to be a bit more clarity done on that, particularly for sites that share export or have DC coupling.
And then we've got one from Jonathan. What will be the impact on curtailment for distribution, A&M and tech limit connections? Is reordering the transmission queue positions going to have no effect on distribution LIFO stacks? Might have been answered lower down the chat, but
yeah. So it probably will change, dependent on what the new queue looks like. I would assume that transmission constraints would hopefully reduce should you have a reduced transmission queue, which could then mean your technical limit could be higher. For DNO curtailment, again, that would just depend on what happens to the DNO queue in the area. But I can't see how you would ever be pushed into a worse curtailment position. But yeah.
Has there been any information on how co-located sites will be treated? I.e., do we know what the impact would be for a site in a zone with high PV demand but low BESS demand?
Yeah, good question. So that's my understanding from reading the methodologies is that the two technologies will be treated separately. So it might be that you get given a connection for the PV and your BESS is given a connection date of 5 years later. And again, still not clear how that will be treated for distribution contracts because presently distribution contracts are not typically worded in a way where you can phase them. But the ENA has been working on this.
And then one from Phil Jones. Is the Clean Power 30 quotas, are they confirmed? Do they include built-in consents for approved projects? If so, there is limited headroom for BESS in Zone 17, for example.
Yeah, so they're not approved, no. The original report that NESO did was advice to government. Government published their action plan on this last Friday. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that. Excuse me. This whole process will be going to Ofgem for decision on Friday. But yeah, the current the assessment will consider already built capacity, and then it'll be looking at what additional is then needed.
Right, thank you. That's all the ones from the Q&A. There are a couple more in the chat if you wanted to have a look through those. One from Maurice. What protection has Ofgem put in place for developers in holding operators to program and project milestones? As time and time again, we see them delay projects. My reading of the consultation does not show much protection for the developer.
Yeah, no, totally agree. All the onus has been put on the developers, and that's why Ofgem have published the end-to-end connections review consultation, which I believe closes on the 12th of January or the 13th of January, which is much more about what can the network operators do to deliver. And it's from my initial look through it looks quite good. There's a lot of carrot and stick in there, so I'm hopeful that that will apply the same level of scrutiny to the network companies.
Do changes to the G99 application process affect all applications or just over 1 megawatt?
Anything that's G99, so anything over 16 amps per phase, I believe, is the cutoff. So it's a good point because yeah, it could affect small scale rooftop schemes.
Any views on how oversubscribed the queue will be for projects with a pre-2030 date, but who meet all the new criteria? How many projects in this space with investments already made are going to be bumped?
Depends on where you are and what technology you are, I suppose. We need to look into the data, but yeah, if you're in an area that's oversubscribed and you are back in the queue and you've got planning after someone else, for example, then you might be pushed a bit further out. I think that's why they want to bring these protections in for projects that are already considerably well developed. If they've already submitted their planning application, they will be put at the front of that reordering.
Perfect. I think that's all the questions we have in the Q&A. All of the Q&A will be published and distributed out to everyone. So all the questions that have been answered here, you'll be able to access. If anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to shoot. I think that's all of them.
Cool. Thank you everyone for your time. We will share the slides. Appreciate there's a lot of detail in there, so do take time to read through. And if you have any further queries or would like to help understand the impact on your pipeline, then don't hesitate to get in touch with either of us on the call. Yeah, we look forward to speaking to you soon. And I guess have a very Merry Christmas as well. I've not actually wished that to anyone yet, so all the best. Take care.